Okay, welcome to a video where we're going to review some code. So I saw a post on the FlutterHelp subreddit. It said, hey, here's some code. Could you just rate it? It's like a side project tutorial sort of thing. Uses some fake API. How could I make this code better? And I thought, well, that would be a pretty good idea for a video and just going over it in a video. So we're just going to look at what they got here and just go over ways to improve it. So yeah, it's going to be a bit of like a code review. And if you want to see your own code reviewed, you could post a link to it or send me a message, and you could make this into a series if you enjoy it. So yeah, anyways, here it is, a social media app. It is a Instagram clone. So it uses getX. I do have a video on why I don't like getX. It would be much better to learn how Flutter works than how getX works, but that's not going to be the main topic of the video. So let's first start off and say that this is the lib folder, so the Flutter project here, and then we get the lib. And things are split up into nice ideas here, so the components and the modules and the models all being in different folders. The folder structure makes sense here. I also like to have like a constants file for just static things that are shared everywhere, usually like strings. And then, storage here. So let's go first into the models, I think. So the models give us an idea of what data entities exist in this app. So we got comment, message, post, and user model. And one thing I notice here is that only post has a .g file. So let's look at that. So first, let's look at a comment. So we can see that comment here has a post ID and its own ID, name, email, body. All that makes sense. But one thing is that usually for data classes, you want everything to be final. And the reason you want everything to be final is that the concept of a comment is a representation of what's actually on your server. So if you just go post ID equals 12, that's not indicative of like reality. Like the reality is that comment is in a database with a certain ID. So you shouldn't be able to just set the name to whatever you want. You should need to make an API call and get a new comment back with different data. So for data models, I would like to prefer to have final for all of these variables here. Next thing that we see is that this is a comment model from JSON, so it's great to have a factory constructor and a toJSON from JSON. But one thing that we can look at is that the JSON, you don't need to do this stuff yourself. There are two packages that you can use to make this generated code. And we can see that he actually did that in a different model, but just as a refresher, there's JSON serializable and JSON annotation. So actually, let's go to the pub.dev. So instead of writing out the, let's just go like this. So instead of writing out all of the toJSON from JSON stuff, you can instead use JSON serializable. You annotate your class there, and then you give just a whole bunch of final variables, and then it figures out all the toJSON from JSON for you with this $_. And this package is absolutely incredible for nested entities. So let's say that a comment model actually owned an entire user or something like that. It can have nested models in each other and do lists and maps of different stuff, and it's all really, really easy. So for this type of model where everything is just a string getting plucked out of the JSON, it's not so bad. You can imagine if body was actually an object and it had a whole bunch of data and it was a body model, doing the from JSON there and then plucking out everything on it would be kind of annoying. So this is a great package to use, and we can see that in a different model they actually did that. So let's go to the other models folder here, or file, and we got post.dart. Now post.dart, maybe they're just experimenting with different ways that you could do this, but it does have the serializable there. And yeah, it has the from JSON and the toJSON and the generate methods. So this is something that I would like to see for all of the models. I think that's a good idea. But one thing, when you're using JSON serializable, it can figure out this stuff for you. You don't actually need to make list methods and stuff like this to do this. Like it'll figure it all out for you if you have like a nested model in there, something like that. So yeah, you shouldn't need to use JSON.decode at all for most Flutter apps. JSON serializable should solve all of those issues. So yeah, you just add that part there, and then you can do that. Okay, so that's good for the model. So let's look at a component. So let's look at just the first one and see how about chat text field. Okay, so chat text field extends stateless widget, and it takes in a controller that isn't final. That's interesting. Does that actually compile? I thought everything had to be final for widgets. Maybe it's just a linting issue. But then you have var on submitted and var on icon pressed. So these are not strongly typed. When you just go var something and you don't give it initializer, the compiler has absolutely no idea what type that's supposed to be. And I imagine the reason that this isn't typed is because typing with functions can be a bit tricky to actually write it out. So let's do that. Let's see what that's going to be. So we know from Flutter development that usually an onPressed is something called a void callback. So let's look at that first. So a void callback is something like this. So this is my test. So it doesn't return anything and it doesn't take anything in either. So you could put this directly into the onPressed of a button. Let's do that. They're now called text buttons. OnPressed, and it is allowed to just go straight into there like that. And let's just make this a text, right? So this is ultimately a void callback. So it's saying make it const. Let's just do that, I guess. Oh, no, it can all be const. Anyways, okay. So what is onPressed? OnPressed is a void function, and it's nullable. So we can tell that by hovering over it and pressing Control there. And when you Control click it, you'll go into it. So we can see that onPressed is something called a void callback. So instead of putting var here, the material guys put void callback. So we can Control click again and see what a void callback actually is. It is something called a type def. So what a type def does is you can strongly type functions so that you know what they're supposed to take in and output, so that these things are strongly typed. So the issue with putting var there is that you could put anything. It doesn't even need to be a function, right? So if I just go var I, what is I? I is absolutely anything. So if I go I equals 1, that's allowed, and I could make I equal to a void callback, and then I could change it to a string. And I can just do whatever I want because var I has no type. Now if you put a type here, the compiler will infer the type, and it will say, hey, this is supposed to be an integer because we initialized it with an integer, and if we make it a double, then it knows it's a double. And we see here, hey, you can't just make a null function into a double. That doesn't make any sense. But if you don't put anything, what I is it's just dynamic. So what I would suggest is changing that stuff so that it is a void callback. But then he has also a function, if we go back to there, where it's onSubmitted. And onSubmitted from a text form field, we know actually has a string input. So that's not a void callback anymore. It takes in a string. So how would we do that? Well, Material probably already has defined that, but let's do our own type def based on that void callback. So let's open up that void callback to the right just as an example to go off of, right? So we go void callback over here, and this is the syntax, right? So let's start with that. So if we want to make our own function of a certain type and have it named, well, we know that the onEditing complete for a text field, it needs to take in a string. And sometimes it's nullable and sometimes it's not, but let's just say it's not nullable. So we would put string input in here, and we could say this is on text field submitted or something like that. Right, so now this is a type def and it's strongly typed. So wherever we say this function must be an on text field submitted, it's not going to allow any function that doesn't have a string input and one argument. So let's test that out. So let's go class, my class, and then have a final on text field submitted. And let's call it that. And then let's make a constructor. Okay, so here we got my class, and now let's make an instance of it. My instance. Okay, so we know that we're going to have a compile error because my class takes in one argument in its constructor, which is right here. And this needs to be an on text field submitted function. It can't just be anything. It's not a var, right? So we could put something in here, and it can just be an anonymous function. So let's try that. So here, do stuff, right? So this doesn't compile. Well, why doesn't it compile? It's because we've on our on text field submitted, we're having a string input. And this anonymous function has no inputs. So if we put string input into here, now that's an appropriate callback that matches the signature that we've given it there. Okay, so that's what my feedback on the var here. And also making this final would be very good. Okay, so what we got here is an aligned, and it's bottom center. It's got a bit of padding, it's a row, and it's got a text form field that's expanded, and then an icon button to send it. Okay, so I can picture what this widget looks like, right? It's a text box and it's in a row, and then beside the text box there is a submit button. Text form field, if it's anything like a text field, I'm pretty sure that we can put a icon right in there in the decoration. So let's check it out. So text form field, and then decoration, input decoration, and then suffix icon can be a widget. Yes, okay. So if you want an icon like a submit button or a toggle visibility for your password, the best place to put that is the suffix icon of the input decoration. What that's going to do is it's going to put an icon on the far right that you can tap, and you can put whatever you want in there. So we can put an icon of icons.send like they have. Oops. And then do whatever with the on submitted, which would be, yeah, submitting that thing. So, oops, that would be named. That would be on pressed. It would do something, and this actually obviously has to be an actual icon, not just an icon data. Whoops. And there we go. So now this is going to make a text form field with that button over there, but it's a much simpler widget hierarchy, and also we're not relying on the parent as much for its constraints for how that's going to be shaped and look and where it's going to be allowed to be put. So that I think this would be a little bit better for if you want like a send button. This works really well for toggle visibility on like a password field as well. Okay, so we're at the message controller, and then input decoration. So yeah, that's where you could put that, and then we got the on field submitted. The other feedback that's just very minor is that generally variables for classes in Dart, you start with a lowercase, like this one. But that's really not a big deal. That's just a code style thing. In other languages, it's capital is the preferred. Okay, so that looks good. So let's look at another random one. So these are just from the initial widget. So let's see, comment widget. So similar thing, these should all be final. This one has the key for its constructor. So I find if you put a trailing comma here, it formats it a little bit nicer. It really doesn't matter though, obviously. Okay, so we got, this is a comment widget. So it's got just a raw material with an elevation of 20, container, some margin, a box decoration, and a radius, so on and so forth. So it looks like this is just like a card kind of widget that wraps a comment. So this, I think, from the structure of it, probably looks pretty nice. It's got the drop shadow, it's got the nice rounded corners, it's got a particular color and a particular border radius, and all that stuff. Now, what I will say though is that this styling is in this file and it's not very reusable. The reason it's not very reusable is because this stuff is defined in line instead of a theme. So if you want your comment widget, if you want to reuse that look for anything else, if it's in here, that's going to be hard to do because you're going to need to pull out the material, the container, and all this stuff. So if this widget ultimately looks a bit like a card, which is what it sounds like, it's elevated and it's got like a little bit of a white color, what you should do instead is go to the theme of your material app and style the cards that you want a certain way. Do it once in your theme, and then all of your cards are going to look a certain way. And then if you want to have multiple card themes, you can make those and then have an inner theme and say, well, the theme for this portion of my app has this card theme, and just make those themes reusable, because setting the border radius in 50 different places in your code is quite tedious, and for some reason different widgets have slightly different ways they like their corners rounded, so it's just hard to remember. So yeah, do it once and set it and forget it. So let's take a look at main and see what the theme actually has, if anything. Okay, so we got main, we got the run app. Oh, we're initializing Firebase in build. So that's not great. So in general, you do not want to put anything that like is a setup step in build, because build, other than the material app, is called many times. Like if you have an animation, build is going to be called like the amount of frames per second that you get, like 30 to 60 or whatever. So this is something that's really only supposed to be called once. And initialize app, knowing from Firebase, this is asynchronous. So if you are relying on other Firebase services, you don't really want to, you want to track the status of whether it's initialized or not. So what I would do is I pull this out and I put it in main and just await it there. Firebase, it starts up so quickly that I've never run into an issue like that. If you have a bunch of heavy duty asynchronous stuff to do, you might want to make a splash screen and make it so that you have like a loading indicator, and then when all of your async stuff is done, then you enter the real part of your app. But yeah, definitely pull this sort of thing out for build. You want build to be what's called a pure function. So let's look at what that is. So a pure function, Wikipedia is probably fine. The return values are identical for identical arguments, and a function has no side effects, right? So initializing Firebase is a side effect. You think for a build function, right? If I give you a build context, you're just going to give me the same widget every single time. And that's not what's happening here. This has a side effect of initializing app, which is not good. Okay, so we got a get material app. Not going to talk too much about get, but anyways, this is how you register with stuff with get. And it looks like there is a bit of theme. So yeah, there's the theme data here, and all it has is the primary color and the primary swatch. Right, so this is a really good place to put things like border radiuses for cards, input decorations, fonts, all that stuff. You set it once, and then you're done. Well, probably not done, but it helps a lot. So you have something like a floating action button, and you're like, oh, I want all of my floating actions buttons to be a certain type of green. Put it here once, and then you don't need to remember or set it for the rest of the time that you want them all to be green. And then also, if you want to change it, you just change it in one spot. And if it's done like this, where it's inline, you can even hot reload it, and then it will change right in front of you, right? So if you hit that lightning bolt button, and it is something that's not static or const in here, it'll hot reload those changes on the screen for you. You can see what they look like, which is really, really quick. Okay, so that's it for main. Let's look at some logic. So let's look at maybe a service. So how about a chat service? Okay, so a little typo in the name now there, chat servy. So we got our final ID is an empty string. Presumably this is just because it's like some sort of test app. Actually, it's hard to tell if it's used anywhere. It looks like this just might be a mistake. Maybe just delete that. It's unused. Okay, so save message. Okay, so we got the message model. So the function signature of this makes sense. This is kind of similar to what you'd see for Firebase. You have a future void. It takes some time to go through. It's the CRUD operation, and it takes in the model, and then it saves it to wherever it's going. So I actually am not super familiar with this get ref and set stuff with the what is get ref? Oh, it's right here. Duh. Okay, so database reference. So this is actually Firebase. So get ref, sender ID, receiver ID. So messages, sender ID, receiver ID. So that's just the structure in the Firebase database. So sender and receiver. So we set that guy, and then we get it. Again, okay, wait. Get ref, sender, receiver, and we set it. And then we also do it again, and we flip the order of the inputs. So it looks like is there actually two copies of the conversation? There's one for each user. That's a bit interesting. Not sure what's going on there. In just data architecture in general, it's good to have a single source of truth for this sort of stuff, so that you don't have weird issues where something half sent. Like what happens if this goes through and they have bad internet and this one failed? Well, now you have two different copies, and they're going to get out of sync with each other, and that could cause some issues with people showing, they show their phone and then they show the other phone and the messages aren't the same, something like that. The name of this one tripped me up a little bit. I thought this had to do with getX at first, but yeah, if this was like build database reference, that might be a better name for readability, so it's more clear as to what it's actually doing. Yeah. So another thing I will say is that accessing Firebase database.instance in these sort of services, it works just fine, but what is better is to use a concept called dependency injection and pass this in. So dependency injection is a scary sounding thing where you just pass it in like final database and then pass it in the constructor. And it seems kind of pointless because it's like, well, I could just access it here. But the reason is that once you get a large enough app and you're getting a lot of unit tests in, you're going to need to mock those services and make design what they're going to do in your unit tests. And you can't actually do that here, right? You can't unit test chat service because it accesses the real Firebase, right? And if it accesses the real Firebase, that's not a unit test anymore. That's like an integration test across your whole platform. So if you pass this guy in and use Mockito or something like that, then you could say, when my Firebase instance, I get the child, then I give them this thing, and then you can set up your test to make sure it's doing what you want. Okay, cool. So let's look at another service. Let's maybe look at login. Okay, so this one's got HTTP and some storage. Okay, so Again here, var token, what is a token? Is it a string? It's probably a string, but it would be good to type that. Also, where with the concept of a service where you're logging in, if you have a public variable that's not final, anything that can touch login service can touch this, which would be very bad if somebody somewhere went token equals null and your service doesn't know what that means. That could cause some really bad bugs. So you want public variables of a service like this to be either final or be a getter, and the reason is just to make sure that like your interfaces are as small as possible so that when things access your login service, they can't do things you don't intend them to do. Like, what do you intend them to do? You intend them to log in, you intend them to log out. You don't intend consumers of the login service to go token equals the string hi. That would be very bad. Also, this message, we'll see what that does. Okay, so anyways, we got our login method here. Generally in Dart, methods start with a lowercase. So we got future bool. So I'm assuming this is a true or false as to whether or not the login worked. So it takes in an email, password, checkbox. I'm not sure. Having a more descriptive name on this might be better. Checkbox is a bit weird. Okay, but anyways, we make our URI to a URL from the login, and then we call a post. So we're doing post, and we get our headers, and we got the application/JSON. I'm pretty sure that there's a constant for this, so you don't need to type it out. So that would be minor, but there's probably like an HTTP content types static strings that you could use instead of hard coding this, just in case you make a typo or something. Okay, so the body is JSON encode, email, password. So even for little tiny models like this, I would say it's quite a bit safer and easier overall to make a model for this. So you make a model called login payload. It's got an email and a password, and you let that JSON serializable do its work and make this for you. The reason is if there's something weird with the parsing or the toJSON, you can configure it there, and it's going to propagate through your whole app, right? If you do JSON encode with the raw stuff in a lot of different places, you're going to have to fix a lot of different places if something weird comes up. For example, all of a sudden this email key changed for some reason. I don't know why it would, but if your API changed, like changing that is going to be a big pain in the butt everywhere, because it's not going to cause a compile error, right? You change this to my email or user email in one place. If another file uses this JSON, it's not going to get changed for free for you. But if you use that JSON serializable, that'll help a lot. Okay, but anyway, so we get ourselves a JSON response from the body. Another code style thing is if you don't intend a variable to be reassigned, you should prefer to use final. That's also not a big deal, but we're never going to reassign response, so you might as well make it so that there's less errors that could possibly happen from reassigning it, so just make it final. But anyway, so we get our response, we print it. So obviously just a tutorial app, so it's not a big deal, but these kind of print codes will go on like Logcat and stuff for a production app. So you don't want print codes, print statements in your real app. That's a bit of a security issue. Like if you accidentally print response.body and it says 500 internal server error, this line crashed, that could actually have like a really big security risk for your whole system, and attackers could use that as like a vector to figure out what your server's crashing in a certain way, so how could they exploit that? So that's not good. It's good if you make like a logging service. So there's login service, but then there's also like a logging, like a logger. And you can have it such that like the print is locked behind the debug, kdebug flag, and then only in production mode do you actually like send errors to like Sentry or something like that. Okay, so we get our status code and it's 200, and then we do the similar thing with the JSON response data token with a capital T. That's interesting. Usually, why would this be lowercase but this be uppercase? See, this is the sort of thing like if this is wrong, it's not going to be a very obvious why. And if it's in a model class where it's only defined once, it's going to be quite a bit easier to fix if this ended up needing to be a lowercase t in the JSON, and this will matter. So that's just another reason you really don't want to do this stuff yourself. You want JSON serializable to do it. But anyways, we get the data and the ID. ID is also capital I. And we go .toString, just print to check it out. Get the token. Printing the token would be very, very bad. So the token is the idea of like this is your access to the app. Like if this is an access token, if an attacker got your access token, they could pretend to be this user if they took the phone or something. So this is the sort of thing like you absolutely should not print this. Even in like a tutorial project, I would say that get out of the habit of printing data this sensitive to the console, because yeah, somebody takes a phone on Logcat, they can see that. Okay, so if checkbox, we save it. Okay, so that's what checkbox means. So I would wonder why we wouldn't save the token, but also the name of this variable is very confusing as to what it actually does. Like this should be called like should save token. But I don't really see a good reason not to save the token for later, because if they log in and they get a token, you're not gonna need to log in for another hour or 12 hours or 24 hours or whatever your tokens expire at. Okay, so then we get the 401. We set the message variable here. Presumably that's an error for unauthorized, else print the body and just see what happened and return false. Okay, so I will say that with anything with internet, one really good habit to get into is to wrap everything in a big try-catch and then make your own type of exception and then throw that instead if something crashes. So there's a lot of different ways that this code could crash in an unhandled way. So the first way that it could crash is that email and password, or let's say the response was screwed up and it had a lowercase t. This would crash with like some sort of null exception, right? Because we have token and then we're going, what if the data was null and then we're accessing this? This would crash with the null exception. This could also crash with some sort of null exception. And then, just anytime you're using the JSON. Also, I think that like socket exceptions, if you time out, that'll actually throw an exception from the post. So instead of it, like if you get a socket exception, you didn't connect at all, you're not going to get a response. There's not going to be a code. So that's like if you're offline or the server's offline, and that will throw an exception. You're definitely going to want to handle that in a service. So one thing that I like to do again is just wrap this whole guy in a try catch. And then what that allows you to do is make your own exception class and then throw that instead, so that when you consume this, you just need to catch login exception. And anything other than a login exception is truly exceptional, and then you can handle that with logging and figure out why your app's crashing. But there's a lot of exceptions that could happen here that aren't like truly exceptional, where something got screwed up on the internet and this is going to throw. So it's not clear to me what's going to happen, where is that exception going to get caught from here. So that's a bit of a risk there. Okay, so logout, we delete that token and we set the token to null. Okay, so this userinfo.token, is this just a static variable that houses their token indefinitely? I would like to find out where that is. So userinfo is in a component? Okay, well, let's look at that. Okay, so we got components, userinfo. Oh, interesting. This isn't really a component. So I'm a bit of a stickler for making sure that things are in the right folder, because they're kind of hard to find later if you stop working on this for 12 months. But this is like some sort of data transfer object or like whatever. It's really not a component like a widget. The other issue is that we have this static string user token, and again, it's public, right? So this is not a good design pattern for who can access user token and why. Well, anything can access user token and anything can set it to null. And those two things are going to be very error prone, because you want better control over tokens than that. So what I would suggest, if we go back, is that make this token a private variable of that service. So let's go back to the service. So that was the login service. So make a private variable that houses that token, like the cache of that token, and then make a getter for it, which might be public, that returns that. And what that does is it makes it so that like other things that are consuming this service cannot get that token. The other thing that you could do is just not even save it in that way, and just make other things load it from storage, so that you only have one source of truth for your token. Because it is possible that these two things do not happen at the same time because they're public, right? So what happens if somewhere else in your app goes user token equals null, but you don't delete it from storage? Well, now you have an inconsistency. Like the cached one that's just a variable is null, but it's still stored in storage. And I've had issues like this in apps where you can get into a really bad state where the app thinks you're logged in, but there's tokens that don't exist, or vice versa, and that can be really bad. And if real users get into that state, sometimes they can't get out of it, because depending on what you're using for storage, that could be saved in like an iOS keychain, and then it doesn't get deleted when you uninstall the app. So let's look at what storage actually is. So storage lives in just the top level. Okay, so it uses the shared preferences plugin here. So there is a better plugin for token type stuff. It does ultimately still use shared preferences on Android, but it for sure uses the encrypted version, which is a better thing for tokens. So here's the shared preferences Flutter, and then here's Flutter Secure Storage. So for tokens and secure data, I would recommend using Flutter Secure Storage because it uses a keychain for iOS, and it uses the encrypted shared preferences for Android, or just like other encrypted type stuff. For shared preferences, it says there is no guarantee that writes will be persisted to disk after returning and not used to be stored for critical data, right? So critical data meaning things like tokens. This is really should be used for true preferences, like I like this color of blue better than this red, and if that gets reset, you just set it again and it really doesn't matter that much. So Flutter Secure Storage does work in pretty much the same way, where it's key value storage. But yeah, I would definitely recommend changing this to Flutter Secure Storage. One thing to be aware of though is that the keychain is not cleaned up when you uninstall an iOS app. So if you're logged in and you have like a token stored, and then you uninstall the app and then reinstall it, that token will still exist there. So this just like a call out that it behaves a bit differently than you might expect, because on Android it wipes it when you uninstall, but iOS it does not. But anyways, we set the token, we can get the token, and we can delete everything. Okay, so yeah, a little more feedback on the names of these. Like, you know they're for a token, but how do I know if I'm just consuming save from somewhere else? This should be called like save token, this should be called like read token, and this should be called delete all. It's not, it actually deletes literally everything. You might even want a different method for deleting only the token. Okay, well I think that's pretty much everything that we want to look at. I don't really want to look at the getX stuff specifically, but we did the main and the storage and the models and the services and some UI. So yeah, overall this is a sweet little side project. You can see the screenshot here. It does look quite nice, and it has some like the full stack of like a mobile app, right? It's got the login, it's got the models, it's got the API, it's got Firebase. It's really quite a big tutorial project. So yeah. Enjoyed doing this video. I hope you found the feedback useful, and if anybody else has any code they want me to look at and rant about, then I would be welcome to it.